Imagine you're a crow. You're just vibing, doing crow things, stealing French fries, judging people from telephone wires, maybe plotting something sinister. Who knows? And then, out of nowhere, a gigantic, weird bipedal creature reaches down and removes a piece of plastic that was wrapped around your leg. What do you do with that information? Do you process it? Do you feel something? Do you fly away thinking, that was a close one? Thanks, big hairless ape? Or is it just nothing? Just noise in the void? That question, whether wild animals actually understand when a human is helping them, sounds like a simple yes or no. But the answer is one of the most fascinating rabbit holes you can fall into. And by the end of this video, I promise you'll never look at a wild animal the same way again. Let's go. First, let's establish something important. Animals are not stupid. I know that sounds obvious, but for a really long time, centuries actually, the dominant scientific view was essentially animals are biological machines. They respond to stimuli. They don't feel things. They don't understand things. They just react. This idea was so widespread that scientists literally had a rule called Morgan's Canon, coined in the late 1800s, which basically said, never attribute a complex mental process to an animal if a simpler one can explain the behavior. Translation: if a dog looks guilty after destroying your couch, don't say it feels guilt. Say it learned that when you come home with that face, bad things happen. Keep it simple. Keep it mechanical. And look, that principle has its place. Science should be cautious. We absolutely shouldn't project human emotions onto everything that moves. But here's the problem. We overcorrected massively. For decades, the idea of animals having rich inner lives, processing intentions, understanding context, reading social dynamics, all of that was dismissed. It was seen as unscientific, naive, almost embarrassing to suggest in serious academic circles. And then the research started rolling in, and it turns out animals are doing a lot more than we thought. Like, a lot more. In ways that should fundamentally change how we relate to the living world around us. Let's start with one of the most well-documented cases in the entire field. Dolphins. There are dozens of verified accounts, not anecdotes from random people on social media, but documented, studied, peer-reviewed cases squash of wild dolphins actively seeking help from human divers. One of the most famous happened off the coast of Hawaii in 2013. A wild bottlenose dolphin approached a group of divers during a night dive. The dolphin had a fishing hook embedded in its pectoral fin with a long line wrapped around it, severely limiting its movement. And here's what gets you. The dolphin didn't panic. It didn't flee. It swam directly to one specific diver, Keller Laros, and held still while he worked on removing the hook. When the line was tangled in a way that made it hard to reach, the dolphin actually repositioned itself, rotated its body, to give the diver better access. Let that sink in for a second. This was a wild animal, not trained, not conditioned with food, not familiar with this diver, just a dolphin that had a problem, saw a human, and made the decision. This creature might be able to fix this. That's not a reflex. That's not a mechanical stimulus response. That is some form of assessment, some form of intent, some version of the thought, I cannot solve this myself. Maybe you can. And it worked, by the way. The diver removed the hook. The dolphin swam away, but not before staying near the divers for several more minutes. Did it understand what happened? Did it feel relief? We can't know for certain, but the behavior itself is extraordinary. And this wasn't a one-time anomaly. Reports like this come from all over the world, across species, across decades. Something is happening here that deserves a serious look. Now, let's talk about something even more surprising. Ravens and crows. These birds are terrifyingly intelligent. We're talking about animals that can solve multi-step puzzles, use tools, plan for the future, recognize individual human faces, and, here's the kicker, hold grudges. Not metaphorical grudges. Actual, long-lasting, socially transmitted grudges. Researchers at the University of Washington conducted experiments where they wore specific masks while trapping crows, and then continued walking around campus wearing neutral masks or the trapping mask at different times. The crows didn't just remember the threatening face, they recruited other crows to mob that face. Crows that had never even seen the original trapping event would dive bomb the mask because they'd been told about it. They gossip. Crows literally gossip about you. They build reputational profiles of humans. They share them. They update them over time. But the flip side of this is equally interesting and far less discussed. Crows also remember kindness. People who regularly feed crows report receiving gifts, shiny objects, buttons, small pieces of glass, left precisely where the food is usually placed. The crow isn't just taking, it's reciprocating. It has a social model that includes you, and in that model, you have a relationship that involves mutual exchange. Now apply that to rescue scenarios. If a crow is freed from a trap by a human, is it capable of associating that experience, that specific individual, that specific action, with something net positive? Based on everything we know about corvid cognition, the answer appears to be yes. Not in the reflective, language-mediated way a human processes an experience, but in a deep, encoded, behaviorally real way that absolutely shapes what happens next. Which means when a crow lets you help it, really lets you, stays calm, looks at you, doesn't immediately flee, it might be running a calculation. A rapid, intuitive cost-benefit analysis in a brain the size of a walnut that somehow outperforms most corporate software in terms of social sophistication. Let's pause here and address the skeptic in the room, because it's a fair argument and it deserves respect. Maybe the animal isn't understanding help at all. Maybe it's just exhausted. Maybe it's in so much pain or distress that it can't flee. Maybe it has simply run out of options and the human proximity becomes irrelevant compared to the immediate biological crisis it's experiencing. That's a legitimate scientific concern. It applies to some cases, certainly, but here's where it gets complicated and fascinating. Researchers studying animal cognition have identified something called prosocial behavior, helping behaviors that extend beyond narrow self-interest. And it appears across species in ways that suggest something deeper is going on beneath the surface. Elephants have been observed helping each other out of mud pits, using their trunks to assist fallen companions, and, in remarkable documented cases, approaching humans who appeared injured or vulnerable. There are accounts from rangers in African wildlife reserves of wild elephant herds pausing near an injured human, moving carefully around the person rather than stampeding, and in some cases remaining in the area until the person was found by others. Wild elephants in multiple regions have also been observed covering the bodies of deceased humans with branches and leaves, the same mourning behavior they display for their own dead. That is not a reflex. That is not self-preservation. That is something that looks startlingly like empathy, applied across the species barrier. To creatures they have every evolutionary reason to be wary of. The scientific term is cross-species empathy. It's real, it's studied, and it forces us to radically reconsider the idea that animals are simply responding to stimuli without any deeper emotional processing. But let's get back to the central question, because knowing that animals can feel something and knowing that they understand help specifically, those are two different things, and the distinction matters. Here's a study that tried to draw exactly that line. Researchers in Japan conducted a series of experiments with wild-born capuchin monkeys, small, highly intelligent primates frequently used in cognition research. They designed scenarios where a human would either actively help or actively obstruct a monkey's attempt to reach food. The monkeys could observe these scenarios from a neutral position. They were just watching, and then they were given a choice: accept food from the helpful human or from the obstructive one. Overwhelmingly and consistently, the monkeys chose food from the helpful individual. But here's the part that really matters. When the monkeys observed a human being obstructive or unkind to a completely different third party, not themselves, not anyone they knew, just some other individual, they still subsequently rejected food from that human. They didn't just track whether someone was good or bad to them personally, they tracked whether someone was good or bad in general. They were making moral evaluations of humans based on witnessed behavior toward others. A monkey is sitting there watching you interact with a stranger, deciding what kind of person you are, and filing that information away for future reference. Wild animals are watching us far more carefully than we watch them, and they are drawing conclusions. Okay, now we have to talk about something that often gets glossed over in the more feel-good accounts of human-animal encounters: the role of acute stress and something called tonic immobility. When a wild animal is caught, trapped, injured, or otherwise immobilized, its body floods with cortisol and adrenaline. Its entire nervous system shifts into extreme threat mode. And in that state, One of the things that can happen, and this has been documented extensively by wildlife rehabilitators, is an involuntary behavioral shutdown called tonic immobility. It's a deeply ancient survival mechanism. The animal freezes completely. It becomes limp and still. And from the outside, it can look remarkably like cooperation, like calm, like trust. This is genuinely important because it means we have to be very careful about interpreting an animal's stillness as understanding or acceptance. Wildlife rehabilitators, the people who literally dedicate their careers to this work, are acutely aware of the difference. And what they'll tell you is that there is a qualitative distinction between an animal in tonic immobility and an animal that has actually settled. In a genuinely relaxed animal, the breathing changes, the muscle tone changes, the eyes are different. The animal may actually lean into contact rather than simply enduring it. One raptor rehabilitator with over 15 years of experience described her observations like this. There are birds she has worked with across weeks of recovery who, by the time they're ready for release, will turn their head toward the sound of her footsteps specifically, not toward strangers, not toward other workers in the facility, toward her. Not because she bribed them with food during those interactions, because she consistently represented something. Safety, predictability, calm, the absence of threat. Something changed in how those birds mapped that particular human presence. And that mapping includes some functional version of, this is not danger. This might even be the opposite of danger. Whether you call that trust, or learned association, or something else entirely, it is behaviorally real, and it is distinct from simple stress paralysis. Now let's get to the case that stops everyone cold. Humpback whales. In December 2011, a humpback whale was spotted entangled in crab trap lines off the coast of San Francisco. The lines were cutting into its body, wrapped across its mouth and pectoral fins. It had been struggling for what appeared to be hours. It was exhausted. A team of divers was dispatched. What followed was a rescue operation that lasted over an hour. The divers, tiny relative to the animal, completely vulnerable, swam around this creature methodically, working with specialized knives to cut through thick lines without injuring the whale further. The whale held still, a 50-foot, 50-ton animal that could have ended every diver present with a single involuntary movement. That could have panicked and caused catastrophic injury to itself and the entire team. It held still for over an hour, as strangers worked all around its body. And then, when the last line was finally cut, the whale didn't just disappear into the deep. It circled back. It approached each diver individually, slowly, deliberately. One diver described being nudged, gently, firmly. Contact that felt intentional rather than accidental. Another said the whale positioned itself so that its eye was level with his face, and just stayed there, looking. Eye contact with an animal whose eye is the size of a grapefruit. Marine biologists have discussed this encounter in depth. Was the whale simply recalibrating its position after being restricted for hours? Was it investigating these strange neoprene-covered objects that had been swarming it? Possibly. Those are legitimate hypotheses. But here's what's harder to explain away. The whale distinguished between divers. It approached each one specifically. It did not behave uniformly toward the water around it. It behaved differently toward the individuals who had been working on freeing it. That is not random post-stress behavior. That suggests something, some form of registration, some form of recognition of what had just happened. And who had caused it? Let's zoom all the way out now and ask the evolutionary question, because it's the one that really ties everything together. Why would wild animals have any capacity to recognize helping behavior from humans? Evolutionarily, it's almost paradoxical. For the vast majority of our shared history, a human approaching a wild animal meant one of a very small number of things, and none of them were good. Predation, trapping, capture. The instinct to flee from humans is ancient and deeply wired. So where does this openness come from? Part of the answer probably lies in how social intelligence works across species as a general cognitive architecture. Animals that live in complex social groups, dolphins, elephants, primates, corvids, wolves, need to read intentions continuously. They need to evaluate whether a group member approaching them is coming to groom them or challenge them. They need to understand hierarchy, alliance, threat, support. They need to build working models of other minds. That cognitive architecture, the machinery that reads behavioral cues and maps them to internal states and future actions, might simply transfer to humans because it's flexible by design. Evolution built a tool for reading social intention. That tool works on creatures the animal was never specifically evolved alongside because the underlying behaviors, approach without threat posture, slow movements, vocalizations that don't signal aggression, read the same way regardless of species. A dolphin reading a diver's body language isn't doing something miraculous. It's doing something very ordinary, reading social cues and applying it to an unusual subject, which leads to an idea that is simultaneously simple and profound. Wild animals might understand human kindness not because they know what a human is, but because they know what kindness looks like. Period. In anyone. In anything. The signal is the signal, regardless of the body it comes from. Now I want to spend some time on something that the feel-good compilation videos never mention. The failures, the limits, the cases where it doesn't work, because they're just as scientifically important and they tell us something real about how complex this picture actually is. Wildlife rehabilitators will tell you plainly, some animals never relax in human care, ever. They remain at maximum threat response from intake to release. They never show any behavioral sign of registering the help being given. They explode out of the carrier on release day without a backward glance, and that is exactly right and good. That is a wild animal doing precisely what it should do. Is that because those animals lack the cognitive architecture to recognize helping intent? Is it because the trauma of capture overwhelmed any capacity for nuanced processing? Is it simply individual variation, the same kind of variation that makes some humans naturally trusting and others naturally guarded? We genuinely do not know. And anyone who tells you they do is oversimplifying. There's also a darker complication that rehabilitators lose sleep over. Some animals become too comfortable. They learn to associate humans with safety, with food, with the absence of threat, and they carry that association back into the wild, where it makes them dangerously approachable, vulnerable to people who do not mean well, habituated in ways that dramatically reduce their survival odds. This is why serious wildlife rehabilitation involves deliberate, careful management of human contact, feeding animals from behind barriers, using puppets for some species rather than bare hands, minimizing the animal's exposure to human voices, faces, and scent. You have to help without letting the animal know it's being helped by a human specifically. You have to be kind without being recognizably you. Which sounds like an absurd philosophical paradox. And yet it is a Tuesday in the life of a wildlife rehabilitator. Let's bring this back down to earth. To something personal. The reason this question matters to people, the reason videos about it get watched at 2 in the morning and shared without comment because the sharing is the comment, is that it touches something very deep in how we think about connection, about whether kindness has a currency that crosses the barriers we assume are absolute. We want to believe that goodness is legible, that it can be read, that something in the universe, even something with a brain the size of a walnut or a brain the size of a small watermelon inside a skull the size of a car, can feel the difference between being helped and being hurt. And the science, imperfect and unfinished as it always is, points in a direction that is genuinely astonishing. It might be true, not universally, not with every animal in every situation, not in a way that maps cleanly onto human emotional categories or cinematic rescue narratives, but in a real, measurable, reproducible, behaviorally observable way. Wild animals show sensitivity to helping intent. They calibrate social trust based on experience. They carry the memory of kindness in ways that influence their behavior long after the moment has passed. The crow remembers your face for years. The dolphin repositions its body to help you help it. The capuchin monkey refuses food from someone it watched be unkind to a stranger. The whale circles back and makes eye contact. None of that is nothing. None of that is coincidence. None of that is biology being accidentally poetic. That is intelligence. That is social awareness. That is something that does not have a simple name yet because we're still learning how to talk about minds that are not human. So here's what this means for you, practically. Today, every encounter you have with a wild animal contributes to that animal's dataset on what humans are. And those datasets are not private. They spread through corvid warning networks, through elephant herd memory, through the behavioral modeling of young animals watching adults, through the accumulated experience of creatures who were here long before we were, and who are paying far closer attention to us than we have ever paid to them. When you stop to help, when you make the small, inconvenient effort to move a turtle off a road, to call a wildlife hotline about an injured bird, to slow your car for an animal crossing, to just for one moment see the creature in front of you as something that has an interior life and a perspective on the world that matters. Not in a vague, abstract, feel-good way, in a real way, in a way that echoes through social networks you cannot see, in species whose cognition we are only beginning to understand. And somewhere out there, a crow is watching, running a facial recognition algorithm it built entirely by itself, from experience, for free, filing you in a mental folder, deciding what kind of creature you are. You might as well make it a good one.